Okay, welcome back to week 4, American Literature, a genre study of mystery fiction. So, last week we got through the first couple of pages of a study in Scarlet, and we're introduced to the two main characters, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, who have become flatmates. Now, Watson has kind of figured out what Sherlock's job is, basically by coming out and asking directly. And Watson is still a little unsure that Sherlock Holmes has this ability to make major conclusions from little tiny bits of evidence. Sherlock does describe to him how he knew that Watson was a military man, a doctor, and had just returned from Afghanistan. And Watson understands his logical conclusion, but still wants to test Holmes further. He's still thinking it might be a trick. Now, Doyle talks about logic and deduction by way of examples set into the story. When we read Poe's A Murder in the Rue Morgue, Poe actually writes an introduction before he gets to the story, sort of like reading a manual. Pretty dry, pretty boring, about logic and deductive reasoning. So, Doyle's use by placing it in the story makes it a lot more palatable, and you can see some actual use of what becomes later known as the Holmesian paradigm. So Watson finally has an opportunity to test Sherlock again, and he looks out the window. Watson looks out the window, and he sees this older fellow kind of meandering down the street, and he points him out to Sherlock and says, hey, what do you think of that man right there? What can you deduce by your form of logic about him? And on the next slide, we're going to get into detail about that interchange. I wonder what that fellow was looking for, I asked, pointing to a stalwart, plainly dressed individual who was walking slowly down the other side of the street, looking anxiously at the numbers. He had a large blue envelope in his hand and was evidently the bearer of a message. You mean the retired sergeant of Marines? Said Sherlock Holmes. Brag and bounce, I thought to myself. He knows that I cannot verify his guess. The thought had hardly passed through my mind when the man whom we were watching caught sight of the number on our door and ran rapidly across the roadway. We heard a loud knock, a deep voice below, and heavy steps ascending the stairs. For Mr. Sherlock Holmes, he said, stepping into the room, handing my friend the letter. Here was an opportunity of taking the conceit out of him. He little thought of this when he made that random shot. May I ask, my lad, I said in the blandest voice, what your trade may be? Commissioner, sir, he said gruffly, uniform away for repairs. And you were, I asked with a slightly malicious glance at my companion. A sergeant, sir. Royal Marine Light Infantry, sir. No answer. Right, sir. He clicked his heels together, raised his hand in a salute, and was gone. I confess that I was considerably startled by this fresh proof of the practical nature of my companion's theories. My respect for his powers of analysis increased wondrously. There was still remained some lurking suspicion in my mind, however, that the whole thing was prearranged, intended to dazzle me, though what earthly object he could have in taking me in was past my comprehension. When I looked at him, he had finished reading the note, and his eyes had assumed that vacant, lackluster expression which showed mental abstraction. How in the world did you deduce that? I asked. Deduced what? He said petulantly. Why, that he was a retired sergeant of Marines. I have no time for trifles, he answered brusquely, and then with a smile, excuse my rudeness. You broke my thread of thoughts, but perhaps it is as well. So you actually were not able to see that the man was a sergeant of Marines? No, indeed, I said. It was easier to know than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. Even across the street, I could see a great blue anchor tattooed on the back of the fellow's hand. That smacked of the sea. He had a military carriage, however, and regulation side whiskers. There we have the Marine. He was a man with some amount of self-importance and a certain air of command. You must have observed the way that he held his head and swung his cane. A steady, respectable, middle-aged man, too, on the face of him. All facts which led me to believe that he had been a sergeant. Wonderful, I said. Commonplace, said Holmes, though I thought from his expression that he was pleased at my evident surprise and admiration. My dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, there has been a bad business during the night at 3 Laurelston Gardens off the Brixton Road. Our man on the beat saw a light there about 2 in the morning, and as the house was an empty one, suspected that something was amiss. He found the door open, and in the front room, which is bare of furniture, discovered the body of a gentleman, well dressed, and having cards in his pocket bearing the name of Enoch J. Drebber, Cleveland, Ohio, USA. There has been no robbery, nor is there evidence as to how the man met his death. There are marks of blood in the room, but there is no wound upon his person. We are at a loss as to how he came into the empty house. Indeed, the whole affair is a puzzler. If you can come round to the house any time before 12, you will find me there. I have left everything in status quo until I hear from you. If you are unable to come, I shall give you fuller details and would esteem it a great kindness if you would favor me with your opinion. Yours faithfully, Tobias Gregson. Okay, let's talk a little bit about 2 of the characters in this story. from the characters of Sherlock Holmes, A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And this is from the Sherlock Characters Weebly.com. So our first character is Inspector G. Lestrade, or Mr. Lestrade, is a fictional character appearing in several of Sherlock Holmes' stories written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Doyle used the name of a friend from his days at the University of Edinburgh, a St. Lucian medical student, Joseph Alexander Lestrade. Lestrade's first initial is revealed to be G. He is described as a little, sallow, rat-faced, dark-eyed fellow in A Study in Scarlet, and a lean, ferret-like man, furtive and sly-looking. Lestrade is somewhat difficult to pin down as a character. His impatience with Holmes clashes with his kindness to clients, and his level of education appears limited. Despite being described uncharitably by Dr. Watson, Lestrade is pleasant to him, even implying to Watson in a comic way that he doubts Holmes' sanity. He uses basic working-class language without embellishments, and occasionally arcane words. He describes himself as being no chicken for inexperience. His greatest compliment to Holmes' method was to describe them as workmanlike. Although he does place a high value on first-hand detecting, Lestrade is not uneducated. He is fluent in shorthand, dresses well, and his language is predominantly free of street slang and coarse talk. His only linguistic failing is his arcane speech, which is more indicative of a rural origin. The Metropolitan Police preferred to recruit the countrymen as opposed to the London-born. He has, presumably by reputation, gained the trust of the public. Despite a French surname, he shows no overt French ties. Conan Doyle wrote him as a very particular dresser who nevertheless will get muddy in the line of work. He prefers to get out and find his evidence in person rather than solve crimes in his head. His appearance and style very much contrast with Tobias Gregson, which visually increases their rivalry. The two were never paired up in the canon after A Study in Scarlet. Lestrade is unique in that he works with Holmes throughout most of the spectrum of the canon, from the first adventure to one of the last. His character is the only one to appreciably grow and adapt with his exposure to Holmes. By the same token, Lestrade is one of the few people besides Dr. Watson who's capable of moving Holmes to an emotional level. Mr. Gregson. Inspector Tobias Gregson, a Scotland Yard inspector, was first introduced in A Study in Scarlet. Holmes declares him to be the smartest of the Scotland Yarders, but given Holmes' opinion of the Scotland Yard detectives, this is not sweeping praise. In one of the stories, Watson specifically mentions the callous and cool way in which Gregson moved. Gregson first appears in A Study in Scarlet and is the polar opposite of another Yarder Doyle created, Inspector Lestrade. Lestrade and Gregson are such visual opposites. It indicates the barrier Doyle drew between them to emphasize their professional animosity. Gregson is tall, fair-haired, in contrast to the shorter Lestrade's dark features and fat, square hands. Of all of the Yarders, Gregson comes the closest to meeting Sherlock Holmes on intellectual grounds. While acknowledging Holmes' abilities, he even admits to Holmes that he always feels more confident when he has Holmes's aid in a case. He also has some regrettable human flaws. During a study in Scarlet, he publicly laughs at Lestrade's incorrect assumptions, even though he himself is also on the wrong trail. Unlike Lestrade, Gregson overlooks the little gray areas of the law. In The Adventure of the Greek Interpreter, he overlooks Holmes breaking a window in order to enter a premises. The life of Mycroft Holmes, fellow lodger, is saved by this minor criminal act. Watson observes that our official detectives may blunder in the matter of intelligence, but never in that of courage. Gregson climbed the stairs to arrest this desperate murderer in the same absolute quiet and businesslike bearing with which he would ascend the official staircase of Scotland Yard. Okay, so that's a little bit about our two inspectors from Scotland Yard. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Scotland Yard. This is from an article called mentalfloss.com, 8 Arresting Facts About Scotland Yard by Jake ROSSEN. So Scotland Yard is actually the name of a geographic place within the city of London. And this was a small castle that the dignitaries from Scotland would stay during their official visits to London during medieval times. Charles Dickens would actually go out on patrols sometimes because he was friends with one of the policemen, a Charles Frederick Field, a Scotland Yard inspector. Dickens occasionally accompanied patrolmen on their nightly rounds. And he based a character in his novel Bleak House on his friend Charles Frederick Field. Scotland Yard helped in pioneering fingerprinting. Actually, fingerprinting began in India in the late 1800s, but the English-speaking world didn't adopt this forensic technique until 1901. But Scotland Yard was, let's say, second on the list of police bureaus to institute fingerprinting. So Scotland Yard goes to America to the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. And this helped to spread the new science to American law enforcement officials. So today, Scotland Yard is considered probably like the best police force in the world. But running a very close second or equal to is actually, of all places, the Mumbai police force in India. The patrol officers didn't carry guns until like 1994. Like 90% of the metropolitan police officers go on duty without a gun even today. Largely because of a low number of gun-carrying civilians and very strict gun laws in the United Kingdom. So, London is one of the most camera-ridden cities in the world. They're called CCTV cameras. They're on every street corner, storefront, traffic light, all throughout the city. You can't sneeze or cough without being caught on a TV camera somewhere in London. So they have a group of a team called super recognizers. And these are officers that just watch TV all day, all these CCTV cameras, and try to identify different people, looking for pickpockets, petty criminals, fugitives, you name it. So back in 2011, there were a series of riots throughout the city of London. And these super specialists, one particular one, Constable Gary Collins, identified 180 people out of 4,000 while examining the footage of the London riots. Now, there is AI, artificial intelligence, computers that are also able to identify people by facial recognition. So Collins identifies 180, and the computer was able to identify exactly one person. So no worries about AI controlling our lives. Computers have a long way to go to catch up to the human eye and mind. Okay, so also in Scotland Yard, they have a secret crime museum that's hidden from the public. They have like macabre evidence from 150 years of investigative work. And Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, through his connections, was actually able to tour its inventory. So I'm sure it came as a big backdrop to his stories. So let's get back to our story a little bit. So Watson and Holmes go to the scene of number 3, ROSSEN Gardens. And Holmes does not enter the house directly. He spends time investigating the outside premises. In fact, he gets off about 100 yards from the house and walks up the sidewalk, investigating the roadway, the soil, the ruts left in the road by the horse-drawn carriage, looking for footprints. He remarks to Watson that it looks like a herd of buffalo have been walking outside on the crime scene. He's not too happy about that. So Holmes enters the building, goes into the room, and sees the dead body. He notices blood, but eventually realizes that the blood is not from the victim. So Holmes investigates the body. He smells the lips. He looks for hidden wounds. And while he's kind of moving the body around, a woman's gold wedding ring is found. He also pulls out from the pockets some business cards of Enoch J. Dribbler of Cleveland, Ohio. Also 2 letters, one addressed to E.J. Dribbler and one to Joseph Stangerson. There is money that is still there, so the motive is not a robbery. And as he's investigating the room, he finds a word, R-A-C-H-E, written in blood on the wallpaper or wall. So they talk about it a little bit, and the Scotland Yard investigators think that it's an unfinished woman's name of Rachel. But Holmes says no, it's a German word meaning revenge. Holmes concludes his investigation and asks to visit the original police officer who came on the scene of the crime. And that was Officer John Rance. And Rance has finished his shift and is now at home sleeping. So Holmes and Watson get a cab, and they go over to talk to John Rance. But along the way, Holmes sends a message or a telegram, and we're not quite sure what that message is all about, but we're getting there. So Holmes gets a couple of clues already from the crime scene. Now, he does interrupt Officer Rance's sleep, which doesn't please Rance at all. They talk for a while. Holmes tells him, okay, so you walked down the pathway to the front door, then you turned around, you came back out to the street, you hung around there for a couple of minutes, and then you went back to the house. Why did you do that? And Officer Rance is completely astonished. How did you know that? Were you watching me? Were you there? And Holmes said, well, I could just tell by the footsteps that you left in the dirt on your 2 paths going back and forth. And Rance explains himself and says, yes, I did go up to the house, and I saw a light flickering there, so I went to investigate. I know that the people that were living there died of a disease, And he says, I'm not afraid of anything on this side of life, but I was a little worried about spirits and ghosts. So I went back out to the street to see if I could see the other police officer that I was talking to earlier and see if he could or would come into the house with me. Well, the other officer is long gone, so Rance goes into the house himself and discovers the body, and that leads to a whole bunch of policemen getting there. So actually, the Rance is outside the house, and there is a very drunken man stumbling nearby. And Rance is going to arrest him, but he says, basically, I've got way too much going on here. I can't be bothered with you right now. We've got a murder at the house here, and you just go find your way home. So finally, other police arrive on the scene, and Sherlock and Watson are called to come down and investigate. So what on the way, first, Sherlock realizes that that drunken man that's outside the house is actually the murderer. And he's come back to the crime scene looking for the gold ring that Sherlock has found while moving the body around and checking pockets and things like that. So what Holmes had done was he had sent an advertisement to the newspapers that said that he had found a gold ring in Brexton Road this morning, and between the White Hart Tavern and Holland Grove, and come by to 221B Baker Street between 8 and 9 this evening, and I'll give you your gold ring back. Holmes is thinking that the murderer will come back for the ring. But instead, an old woman shows up to claim the ring. However, the old woman is in fact the murderer in disguise. They don't recognize this at the time. The woman leaves, and Sherlock follows her, thinking that she will lead him to the murderer. But she's very crafty. She actually gets away. The police, in the meantime, have tracked down Joseph Stangerson, and they try to find Drebler's address in London by way of a hat that was found at the scene. So the next morning, in the newspapers, there are stories about the murder. They think it might be politically motivated. Holmes and Watson are reading all the different newspaper accounts, and The next characters that enter our story are called the Baker Street Irregulars. And the Baker Street Irregulars are street kids that Holmes employs for detective work, and we'll get into a little bit more on the Baker Street Irregulars in the next slide. But before we do, let's take a look at a video of Sherlock Holmes' Master of Disguise scene from one of the recent movies. And it shows Sherlock following a suspect. At this moment, there came the pattering of many steps in the hall and on the stairs, accompanied by audible expressions of disgust upon the part of our landlady. "It's the Baker Street Irregulars, a division of the detective police force," said my companion gravely. And as he spoke, there rushed into the room half a dozen of the dirtiest and most ragged street kids that I have ever clapped eyes on. "'Tention!" cried Holmes in a sharp tone, and the 6 dirty little scoundrels stood in a line like so many disreputable statues. "In future, you shall send up Wiggins alone to report, and the rest of you must wait in the street. Have you found it, Wiggins?" "No, sir, we ain't," said one of the youths. "I could hardly expect you would. You must keep on until you do. Here are your wages." He handed each of them a shilling. "Now off you go, and come back with a better report next time." He waved his hand, and they scampered away downstairs like so many other rats, and we heard their shrill voices next moment in the street. "There's more work to be got out of one of those little beggars than out of a dozen of the force," Holmes remarked. "The mere sight of an official-looking person seals men's lips. These youngsters, however, go everywhere and hear everything, and they are as sharp as needles, too. All they want is organization. We don't know their purpose or what information they are sent out to discover. Shortly, Holmes and Watson are visited by Inspector Gregson that has news to share on the case. Okay, so Watson and Holmes are at 221B, and after a while they are visited by Inspector Gregson that has some updates and news to share on the case. He was able to find the address of the murder victim, Drebler, by way of tracking down the manufacturer of his hat. So when he goes to Drebler's address, he's met by the landlady, and she tells a story that Drebler had come back late at night, very drunk. Her daughter was present when he came home. He grabs the daughter by the wrist and starts to take her out of the house, saying that she should come with him. He's going to be traveling around Europe. He can take good care of her. And the daughter, wants absolutely nothing to do with this. This calamity is broken up by the girl's older brother. His name is Arthur Charpenter, and he's a lieutenant in Her Majesty's Navy, young, strong guy. He chases Drebler outside the house, chases him down the street, threatening to do bodily harm. He's carrying a big stick, probably whacks him a few times. And long story short, Arthur Charpenter is arrested for Drebler's murder. So he certainly has means, a motive, and opportunity to do so. But Watson says, no, it's not Arthur Charpenter who killed him. Inspector Lestrade visits 221B as they're discussing the case, and he says, quote, "The secretary, Mr. Joseph Stangerson," said Lestrade gravely, "was murdered at Holiday's private hotel about 6 this morning." Okay, so now we've got two murders. Lestrade said upon entering the room, he was quite dead, had been dead for some time. His arms and legs were rigid and cold. And when he turned him over, the owner of the hotel recognized him as being the same who had rented the room under the name of Joseph Stangerson. The cause of death was a deep stab wound in the left side, which must have penetrated the heart. And now comes the strangest part of the affair. What do you suppose was above the murdered man? Sherlock Holmes answers the word R-A-C-H-E, written in letters of blood, he said. So, both Lestrade and Gregerson are shocked. How could you possibly know that? You weren't there. Also part of the murder scene, a milk boy had been passing on his way to the dairy very early in the morning, and he walked down the lane that leads to the back of the hotel. He tells the police he noticed a ladder, which was usually lying on the ground, was raised up against one of the windows to the second floor, and that window was open. And after passing by, he looked back, and he did see a man descend the ladder. He came down so quickly and openly that the boy imagined him to be some carpenter at work at the hotel. And he really didn't take any particular notice of him. But in his mind, he was thinking that it was pretty early in the morning for him to be at work. There were some papers in the pocket of Stangerson, a single telegram dated from Cleveland about a month ago, and contained the words, "J.H. is in Europe. There was no name connected to the message other than JH. And we now have the two murder crimes to solve. Also, was found at the scene a small chip ointment box containing a couple of pills. Lestrade had the pills on him, and Holmes wants to take a look at it. Holmes looks at them. He cuts the pills in half. And there's a dog in the apartment, very sick, dying dog. And Holmes gives the dog one half of one of the pills. And nothing happens. Strange. So he gives the dog the half of the second pill, and within seconds, the dog is dead. Okay, so we have a box with two pills, one very poisonous, the other seems to do nothing. Very strange. So again, Holmes says he knows the name of the murderer, and the arrest of Navy Lieutenant Arthur Charpenter is incorrect. Okay, so knock, knock, knock on the door. More guests. Wiggins, the leader of the Baker Street Irregulars, says he has a cab waiting downstairs. Holmes sends Wiggins down to inform the cab driver to come upstairs and help with some luggage. The cabbie enters 221B, and after a fierce struggle, is arrested and handcuffed. Holmes declares this is the murderer of both men. His name is Mr. Jefferson Hope. So, this is the end of part one. We definitely have means, and we have opportunity, but we do not know the motive. Now, in the second part of the story, which does not take place in England, but starts off in the west of the United States, will provide us with the motive in detail. So your assignment is, after reading part two, describe the motive for these two murders. Okay, we'll take a little break from here and move on to our next slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Mormons, or the Latter-day Saints. This is from history.com, This Day in History, February 10. So the Mormons begin an exodus to Utah. Their leader has been assassinated, and their homes are under attack. The members of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormons of Nauvoo, Illinois, begin a long westward migration that eventually brings them to the valley of the Great Salt Lake in Utah. The members of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints had been persecuted for their beliefs ever since Joseph Smith founded the church in New York in 1830. Smith claimed to be a modern-day prophet of God, and his acceptance of polygamy proved controversial wherever the Latter-day Saints attempted to settle. So polygamy is you can have as many wives as you can afford. In 1838, Smith set up a new spiritual colony in Missouri, but by the next year, anti-Mormon prejudice there proved to be too virulent. The Latter-day Saints next set up camp in Nauvoo, Illinois, but prejudice followed them there as well. Angry mobs murdered Smith and his brother in June of 1844 and began burning houses and threatening members of the group. Convinced that the Latter-day Saints would never find peace in the United States, Smith's successor, Brigham Young, made a bold decision. The Latter-day Saints would move to the still wild territories of the Mexican-controlled Southwest. Young had little knowledge of the geography and environment of the West, and no particular destination in mind. But trusting in God, he began to prepare the people of Nauvoo for a mass exodus. On this day in 1846, Young abandoned Nauvoo and began leading 1,600 Latter-day Saints west across the frozen Mississippi in sub-zero temperatures to a temporary refuge in Sugar Grove, Iowa. Young planned to make the westward trek in stages, and he determined the first major stopping point would be along the Missouri River, opposite Council Bluffs. He sent out a reconnaissance team to plan the route across Iowa, digging wells at camping spots, and in some cases planted corn to provide food for the hungry immigrants. The mass of the Latter-day Saints made the journey to the Missouri River, and by the fall of 1846, the winter quarters were home to 12,000 Latter-day Saints. After a hard journey across the western landscape, Young and his followers emerged into a broad valley where a giant lake shimmered in the distance. With his first glimpse of this valley of the Great Salt Lake, Young reportedly said, "This is the place." That year, some 1,600 people arrived to begin building a new civilization in the valley. The next year, 2,500 more made the passage. By the time Young died in 1877, more than 100,000 people were living in the surrounding Great Basin, the majority of them Latter-day Saints. Young, however, had not escaped the troubles that plagued the church in the East. By early 1848, the Latter-day Saints, having become a U.S. territory after the American victory in the Mexican War, the Latter-day Saints had finally found a permanent home along the Great Salt Lake, but its isolation and freedom from persecution was short-lived. Okay, so let's take a look at a video called Living Like a Pioneer. Okay, so let me get you a little started off on the second half of the story. And this is an example of a flashback in time. So the story itself says the name of the place where we start as the Sierra Blanco. But that's really incorrect. The precise location is the Oregon Buttes in Wyoming, according to Jack Tracy's encyclopedia, Sherlock. And the date is 1847. So we find a single dying man, aged either 40 to 60. It's hard to tell how old he is because he's so beaten up. And he's actually cradling a small female child named Lucy. And they are the only survivors of a group of 21 pioneers making their way out west. They all died of starvation and lack of water. And so this man, John Ferrier, and the child, the only two survivors. The child is not his daughter. They are exhausted and dying of hunger and thirst, and they find a comfortable place amongst the rocks to lie down and die. But in the distance, a large group of religious refugees called the Mormons or the Latter-day Saints are on their trek trying to discover a new place for their group to settle. They notice a off-color pink cloth up on a little hilltop. And the leader of the group sends a couple of guys out to go, what is this pink thing up there? Is it Native Americans or what's going on? It's truly out of place. So they go up and they discover these two people starving and dying. And they invite them and bring them back to the group. Actually, they have to carry them down to the group, to the big boss. And the big boss says, well, here's your choice. We'll take care of you. You're welcome to come along with us, but you have to join our group and our religion. Okay, so John Ferrier and the child have no choice but to go along and join the group and the church. So as a result of Ferrier's expertise, once he recovers, he distinguishes himself as a guide and a hunter for the group. And he ends up with the Mormons that settled in Utah. And he eventually adopts Lucy, the young girl, as his daughter. And due to his help to the group as a guide and hunter, he's granted a large tract of fertile land. And he builds a very simple cabin, but over time, he knows how to build things, and the little cabin becomes a huge villa. So it says, hence it came about that his farm and all that belonged to him prospered exceedingly. In 3 years, he was better off than his neighbors. In 6, he was well to do. In 9 years, he was rich. And in 12 years, there were not half a dozen men in the whole of Salt Lake City who could compare with him. So he does well very successfully. From the great inland sea to the distant Wabash Mountains, there was no name better known than that of John Ferrier. There was one way and only one way in which he offended his co-religionists. No argument or persuasion could ever induce him to set up a female establishment after the manner of his companions. He gave no reasons for his persistent refusal, but contented himself by resolutely adhering to his determination. There were some who accused him of lukewarmness in his adopted religion, and others who put it down to greed of wealth and reluctance to incur expense. Others again spoke of some early love affair with a fair-haired girl who had pined away on the shores of the Atlantic. Whatever the reason, Ferrier remained strictly celibate. In every other respect, he conformed to the religion of the young settlement and gained the name of being an orthodox and straight walking man. So he survives thanks to the help of the Mormons. He does join the church, but he's really not big on the polygamy aspect of their beliefs. And that comes out a little later in our story. The girl grows up to be a beautiful woman, and she also becomes very good with horses. And one day she's out riding, and she gets caught in a herd of cattle and is almost thrown from the horse into a stampede. A young prospector named Jefferson Hope saves her. Come to find out, his father was friends with John Ferrier back in St. Louis. John Hope is not a Mormon. It's love at first sight when he meets Lucy, and he decides to win her heart. He calls on John Ferrier that night and many times thereafter. John Ferrier really likes this young man. And Ferrier had been with the Mormons for 12 years now, and news was very hard to come by because they were so isolated. and they hardly ever mixed with anyone outside their own group. But Jefferson Hope catches up John Ferrier on all the news and what's happening in the world since they joined the Mormons. Jefferson Hope is quite an accomplished young man himself. In the last few years, he was a pioneer in California. He could narrate many strange tales of fortunes made and fortunes lost in those wild days. He had been a scout, a trapper, a silver explorer, a ranchman. And so John Ferrier really liked this young man, and so did Lucy. Long story short, John Hope comes to the home one night and asks Lucy to come with him when he returns in a couple of months. He's going up to his mine to make some money. And Jefferson Hope had already talked to John Ferrier about his plan to basically marry Lucy after he had put some money together. And of course, John Ferrier was okay with that plan. He really kind of wanted his adopted daughter not to end up in some polygamous marriage situation with a Mormon. So he was good with that plan. And Lucy was okay with the plan as well. So Jefferson Hope rides off to work his mining claims. And Lucy that night enters the house, the happiest girl in all of Utah. So that's about where I'm going to leave it off for you now. You'll have to read the rest of the story to really kind of figure out the detailed motive for our two murders back in London. And it all is put together at the end like any good detective story should be. Okay, so that's it for this slide, and we're going to take a left turn and talk about a TV program, smash hit, called Inspector Morse. Okay, so let's switch gears here, and I'd like to talk about another British detective in modern times, and his name is Inspector Morse. Inspector Morse is a British detective drama television series based on a series of novels by Colin Dexter. It starred John Thaw as Detective Chief Inspector Morse and Kevin Whately as Sergeant Lewis. The series comprises 33 two-hour episodes between 1987 and 2000. In 2018, the series was named the greatest British crime drama of all time by Radio Times readers. In 2000, the series was ranked 42 on the 100 greatest British television programs compiled by the British Film Institute. Morse was played by John Thaw and his assistant, Detective Sergeant Lewis, by Kevin Whately. The character of Morse was transformed from the elderly Welshman and ex-boxer of the novels to a much younger, gaudy police sergeant with a family, as a foil to Morse's cynical streak. Morse's first name, Endeavor, is revealed on only one occasion, when he explains to a lady friend that his father was obsessed with Captain James Cook, so was named after HMS Endeavour. On other occasions, he usually answers Morse. "Everyone just calls me Morse," or dryly replies, "Inspector," when asked what his first name is. Thaw appreciated that Morse was different from many other classic detectives, such as Hercule Poirot and Sherlock Holmes. Morse was brilliant, but he was not always right. He often arrested the wrong person or came to the wrong conclusion. As a result, unlike many classic sleuths, Morse does not always simply arrest his culprit. Ironic circumstances have the case end and the crime brought to him. Morse also has a romantic, frequently mild and gentle flirting with or asking out colleagues, witnesses, or suspects, occasionally bordering on the unprofessional, but he had little success in love. Morse is a character whose talents and intelligence are being wasted in positions that fail to match his abilities. He has mentioned several times that Morse would have been promoted above and beyond Chief Inspector at the Thames Valley Police, CID, but his cynicism and lack of ambition, coupled with also the veiled hints that he may have made enemies in high places, frustrate his progress despite his Oxford connections. In the episode's second time around, it is revealed that Morse opposed capital punishment and long sentences, which was upheld by his former superior, who later became Assistant Commissioner of Metropolitan Police, and his former colleague thought of him as a poor policeman and a very good detective. Morse is a highly credible detective and a plausible human being. His penchant for drinking, his life filled with difficult personal relationships, and his negligence towards his health, however, make him a more tragic character than previous classic sleuths. Morse eventually dies in the final episode. The remorseful day is caused by heart problems exacerbated by heavy drinking, although in the book his death is diabetes related. Morse had diverse passions. Music, especially opera, Mozart, and Wagner, were his favorites. Poetry, art, the classics, British real ale, classic cars, and cryptic crossword puzzles. When seen at home, Morse is usually listening to music on his record player, solving a crossword, reading classic literature, or drinking ale. In his home, the living room has a chess set containing classic chess pieces, while the art on the wall includes etchings of Roman ruins. While working, Morse subsists on quickly downing pints of ale in pubs, usually bought by Lewis, who struggles to keep up. Many of his cases touch on Morse's interest, and often his knowledge helps him solve the crime. So let's take a look at a video from the TV series Inspector Morse. It's called Morse's First Name. Okay, so let's talk about our mystery music of the week. This is a song by Michael Jackson called Smooth Criminal. And this is from songmeaningsandfacts.com. Okay, so the best way to describe this Michael Jackson classic is at being centered on Annie, who was assaulted by the smooth criminal. Who these individuals are exactly aren't specified, but for the most part, Annie is chilling inside her apartment, and the smooth criminal comes in and strikes her down, drawing blood in the process. In fact, it seems the reason he is referred to as being smooth is due to his ability to sneak into her home undetected. And the implication is that he continues to assault her until she meets her doom. And the best way to describe Jackson's role in the scheme of things is as a concerned citizen, or perhaps personal associate of Annie's. Thus, he doesn't narrate the tale simply by detailing the intrusion. Instead, he displays a palatable concern for Annie's welfare. Also, the second verse implies that there is an active search going for Annie's attacker, which the singer is very much vested in. So conclusively, the subject of this song is actually Annie, not the smooth criminal. And for the most part, the narrator is expressing two sentiments. One is lamenting the fact that she was a victim of a sly home intruder who violently assaulted her. And the second is a strong concern for her well-being. On a side note from Ray Bina, a dialysis nurse, says, rumor is Michael Jackson had taken a CPR class shortly before composing this song. Annie, are you okay? Is the first line from the CPR script from years back. The CPR mannequins are no longer called Annie. From Bruce Kent, Just Another Part of Me. In the music video, they use wires to accomplish the forward lean. However, it is not possible to replicate in live performances quickly without using wires. Eventually, they found out a new method where they wore special shoes with a slot for pegs that came out from the stage floor at the right time and got attached to the shoes. Also, it was easier to detach by just sliding shoes a bit backward. Michael Jackson and his team of inventors were granted a patent for the shoe design. Okay, so let's take a listen to Michael Jackson's song, Smooth Criminal. Okay, so we're just about out of time for today's lesson. So let's do a quick wrap up of where we've been today. So, first off, we did a quick compare and contrast of Poe and Doyle's approach to informing the reader on the thinking process of deduction and logic. Poe provides a manual, and Doyle shows us by way of example within the story. We talked about another example of Holmes' deduction and logic by way of the retired Marine sergeant. We introduced our two Scotland Yard inspectors, Gregson and Lestrade, and their professional conflict and investigative styles. We talked a little bit about Scotland Yard, its history, some of the famous people connected to it. We were introduced to Sherlock Holmes' secret youth gang of mini detectives called the Baker Street Irregulars, and why they are a valuable asset to Holmes' detective practice. We were able to conclude the end of part one with two murder victims and the apprehension of the murderer. We discovered that we do have means and we do have opportunity for the crime, but no clear motive at this time. We started the first few pages of part two of our story and were introduced to a religious group called the Mormons. Then we switched gears and talked about a contemporary British detective series entitled Inspector Morse. And finally, we concluded with a discussion of our mystery music song of the week, Smooth Criminal, by Michael Jackson, and discovered that Annie in the song is a reference to a CPR doll. So that's about it for this week. You have your assignment to find the motivation in the part two reading. And that's it for now. Thanks for watching. See you again next week. Thanks. Goodbye.